Ms. Bro, I want to take the time to truly thank you for coming in today. And for so many of us, with the most painful moments in our entire lives, we all deal with it in different ways. And for so many people, we need to internalize that and try to move on and bury that pain. And I just want to commend you for being willing to relive this moment in order to enact change in our country and in recognizing the danger of white supremacy. So I just want to take that moment to recognize you and your heroism here today.
Thank you so much. And I would like it as part of the record stated that Heather was killed primarily because Mr. Fields was aiming to kill someone who he thought was black. He drove into a crowd to kill people in support of Black Lives Matter. I have been given a huge platform across the country, in some forms even around the world, because I'm white. And many black parents lose their children, many Muslim parents lose their children, Jewish parents lose their children, and nobody pays attention. And because we have this myth of the sacredness of the white female, I've been given a platform, so I'm going to use that platform to keep drawing attention back to where the issues are.
Thank you, Ms. Bro, and I'm moved in hearing you speak about these issues so eloquently, and in your experience in living through this country and recognizing the privilege that you have. What was that process like for you? How did you come to be able to articulate these points? How did you see it? How did you experience it? And how do you educate others?
Always with the mindset of a teacher. I believe in learning what I need to learn and then putting it back out as simply and straightforward as possible for the listener. I'm still doing that. I find a lot of people have no clue of the privilege that they have, nor how they should be using that privilege. As I mentioned before, many people think being non-racist is okay, and that's enough to solve our country's problems, and instead we need to be actively anti-racist.
And what is the distinction between being non-racist and anti-racist?
Non-racist is saying I don't recognize anybody's color, I think that we're all equal and we should all be treated fairly, and that's kind to a point. I understand what they're trying to say, and it comes from a place of good intention. However, we need to recognize our differences. We need to rejoice in our differences. America is stronger for all of our differences brought together, and we need to accept that and go out of our way to stand up against racism when we see it. To be anti-racist means to take an active stance of I am not going to tolerate that in my presence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms.
Thank
Bro.
you.
Mr. Ricci, the San Bernardino attack was labeled, the San Bernardino attack of December 2nd, 2015, was labeled as a domestic terrorist incident. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Mr. Austin, do you know the June 12th, 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting was also labeled as a domestic terrorist incident, correct?
That's my understanding.
Mr. Salim, when Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and murdered 9 African-American worshipers, was that labeled as an incident of domestic terrorism?
I don't believe it was, but there's no question that it was.
So it was, in your belief as a leader in this space, it was an incident of domestic terrorism, but it was not labeled as such.
That's correct.
Was the white supremacist shooting at Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue labeled as a domestic terrorist incident?
I'm not aware that it was, although then Attorney General Sessions came out and called it that, but the charges that have been brought to bear and are currently playing out in court are not ones of terrorism.
So despite all of that rhetoric that we were hearing, they weren't actually labeled, these white supremacist incidents were not labeled as domestic terrorist incidents. And I really dug into some of these distinctions. What was labeled as domestic terrorism? What was labeled as a hate crime? And I could not help but, as much as I tried to dig in and explain, I could not help but feel and see that attacks committed by Muslim Americans were almost automatically labeled as domestic terrorist incidents, yet white supremacist shooting after shooting after shooting is not. And I can't help but come to the conclusion that these labels, what's being labeled as terrorism, is almost exclusively coming down to the identity. And it seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence. Do you find similar patterns, Mr. Salim?
I think when we look at, and I'll just call it what it is, the terrorism that has been perpetrated against not just Jewish communities, but against Muslim communities, against Christian communities in Charleston, against Sikh communities in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and a range of other communities that organize based on race, national origin, ethnicity, color, etc. Like these acts that take lives, I don't know how you can label these actions in the eyes of the victims or the families or the communities that are affected anything other than acts of terrorism.
Thank you very much. And one last line of questioning. Mr. German, in your 16-year career as an FBI special agent, you spent a great deal of time undercover in white supremacist organizations, is that correct?
Yes.
And what were some of the impacts or effects that you saw, if any, with some of these groups that were not being recognized as white supremacist groups, some violence or acts you see committed that they kind of get off without being labeled as white supremacist incidents? Does that affect the dynamics of those groups? Does it embolden them? What did you see?
It certainly emboldens them, and it deprives law enforcement of crucial intelligence. There was one particular group that when we started engaging with them, they were bragging about certain bombings they had committed. And we struggled to try to find evidence that those bombings actually occurred, and it turned out they had all been treated as vandalism. Fortunately, nobody had been physically hurt in those bombings, but it was a progression toward a more violent plan. And had there been more focus on actually identifying these incidences and calling them what they are, I think that could have been interdicted much sooner.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. German.